The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. The individual slave, property of one master, is assured an existence, however miserable it may be, because of the master's interest. The individual proletarian, property as it were of the entire bourgeois class, which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the class as a whole. The slave is outside competition. The proletarian is in it and experiences all its vagaries. The slave counts as a thing, not as a member of society. Thus the slave can have a better existence than the proletarian, while the proletarian belongs to a higher stage of social development and himself stands on a higher social level than the slave. The slave frees himself when, of all the relations of private property, he abolishes only the relation of slavery, and thereby becomes a proletarian. The proletarian can free himself only by abolishing private property in general. Now, of course, let's actually particularize the universals established last section. First, with the slave laborer. Of course, by this point, we still have to contend with universalities, yet we are dealing with actual abstractions. So keep that in mind during this entire section, and the following sections, of course. To take stock of the first line of this section, what the heck does Engels mean about selling? In the sense Engels is trying to stop down at this moment, and later on in the work, for which Engels actually explains later on in the following lines, he's setting a conditional definition that he'll add on to later. That is to say, the slave's identity, one's being, is found under the yoke of the same master, no matter what happens to the master, as long as the master lives. Lest the master dies, is freed from the master, or they escape from the master. For the pro, they may have a job, but their job is insecure, always thanks to the mechanisms of the market, and must contend with the reserve army of labor that seeks the same or similar jobs they are contending for or are currently employed in such. To just go off of Marx, social being determines class consciousness. I don't really have to explain it here now, do I? Now, because of that condition, he can expand the definition to fit under this condition that necessitates the condition to begin with. Because the slave always lives under one master, they are assured to be a slave no matter the cruelties of such, because the master needs a slave to stay a master and to not have to work what they need or want to stay as such. For the pro, they are given an existence when employed, but it remains always insecure, since the bourgeois class will buy into the labor power of the pro when they need it to sustain operations or to grow. But if they hit the red economically, they'll be more than happy to let go of the individual pro. In part of this contingency, the proletariat's secured existence, that the bourgeoisie needs them, is actual because some pros' secured existences aren't always guaranteed, because some pros are needed by some bourgeoisie for some occasions, or for good chunks of time, for that matter of fact. To elaborate on this matter, if I say all unicorns have one horn, then that'll just be a true statement. But if I said some unicorns have no horns, or have multiple horns, that assures and implicates the existence of the unicorn. A universal doesn't assure the existence of particulars. The particulars themselves assure the existence of the universal itself. Getting back on track, let's look at competition for a bit. Much like the selling aspect, the different universal working classes, have a defined relationship to competition. Slaves don't have to deal with a reserve army of labor, since all are equally employed and all are equally oppressed. A slave will always be employed so that a master can facilitate what they need done, even at the cost of the slave. The pro, as aforementioned earlier, has to deal with the reserve army of labor, the unemployed, constantly when trying to acquire a job, or even at work, since their existences aren't secured at all. This just goes back to feed into the conditional definition Engels established earlier. The penultimate revelation of the worker and the slave is the fact of how they are socially viewed. Since the slave is sold once and for all, they constitute as a thing for society to use. Thusly, they have a better existence, since they have yet to develop class consciousness to the level of the pro, and don't have to partake in the rituals of society that keep society alive and actual. For the pro, however, they have socially developed and taken all the social advances of their previous stages, including the slave that transformed itself away from the slave. Thusly, they are socially higher than the slave, but can be treated worse than such, for all sorts of different reasons, for all sorts of differing scenarios. Thusly, it gives the final statement soundness. The slave, being socially lower than the pro, can only free themselves and become a pro after abolishing, superseding in a dialectically negative manner, the relation of slavery, the relationship between the slave and the master. This can be seen within the end of the American Civil War, as a matter of fact, where slavery was legally abolished. Mind you, legally. It still applies to prison labor, mind you. However, getting back on track, and those slaves became pros. That was way worse than their previous existence. The reasons behind such already explained in this section. However, in the case of the American Civil War, or the aftermath of such, it became a worse experience to work as such, thanks to the tenant sharecropping system that put them in perpetual debt and forced them to work constantly at the whims of the landlord themselves. But I won't go into that deep of a conversation for that one section, maybe for another video. Anywho, getting back on track, the pro can only free themselves by abolishing, superseding once more, private property in its universality. To touch on private property, which was discussed in section 05 for a bit, it means any means of production, MOP, that produces commodities and products, not personal property, which can be your house, your cheese wheel, or your PC. And PC means personal computer in this scenario. To end this section off, this really cements the differences between a slave and a worker, and why either aren't one-to-one entirely when comparing each other respectively. Now, let's look at the serf themselves in relationship to the worker themselves. The serf possesses and uses an instrument of production, a piece of land, in exchange for which he gives up a part of his product or part of the services of his labor. The proletarian works with the instruments of production of another for the account of this other in exchange for a part of the other for the product. The serf gives up, the proletarian receives. The serf has an assured existence, the proletarian has not. The serf is outside competition, the proletarian is in it. The serf liberates himself in one of the three ways. Either he runs away to the city and there becomes a handicraftsman, or instead of products and services, he gives money to his lord and thereby becomes a free tenant. Or he overthrows his feudal lord and himself becomes a property owner. In short, by one route or another, he gets into the owning class and enters into competition. The proletarian liberates himself by abolishing competition, private property, and all class differences. Let's take stock of these two sentences that Engels lays down in this section. The serf owns the means of production, MOP once more again, so they can carry out their task while still being bound by the land thanks to the lord. The proletariat lacks the MOP, so they must utilize the MOP that the bourgeoisie owns but doesn't work with necessarily. At the end of the day, the serf retains a part of their produce. The prole never gets to retain even a small snippet of their produce at all. This is actually a major conditional definition set up right here in this section that was already being built up in the work along the way, implicitly and explicitly. The prole must lack control over the means of production and must still work with the means of production in order to get what they need. Much like to the slave, the serf has an assured existence and is outside of competition. Of the difference here between the two is that there are different relations of production between the two, but this universally carries through between the two. Again, the particulars makes actual the universal, as aforementioned. The serf is bound to a contractual obligation in the form of an oath to stay in the land and work for the lord for their protection. The slave must work at the fear of the master's protection killing them because they didn't follow the master's whims. To go on the line of the serf gives up, the proletarian receives for just a little bit, it basically states an economic outcome of the conditional definition set up for them. The serf gives up a part of their produce to live under contract. The prole receives some unit of currency, money in this case, to acquire their means of living, their means of subsistence. This statement becomes more and more relevant later on, so keep this in mind. To end it off on liberation, the serf can become a handicraftsman under the guild system that they decided to run for, that being that they ran into the cities and gave up their peasant life, or become a freeman by buying off their contractual obligations so they don't have to serve under the lord anymore and just become a free peasant, or overthrow the feudal lord to become such lord in their uprising. In any case, they end serfdom by becoming the ruling class that later enforces their own serfdom on other people, or entering competition to transform their social status as a working class member. The prole becomes free by superseding competition itself, private property, and the class differences between the classes that plagues their society that they currently live in. In contrast to the proletarian, the so-called handicraftsman, as he still existed almost everywhere in the past century, and still exists here and there at present as a proletarian and most temporarily, his goal is to acquire capital himself wherewith to exploit other workers. He can often achieve this goal where guilds still exist or where freedom from guild restrictions has not yet led to the introduction of factory-style methods into the crafts nor yet to fierce competition. But as soon as the factory system has been introduced into the crafts and competition flourishes fully, this perspective dwindles away and the handicraftsman becomes more and more a proletarian. The handicraftsman therefore frees himself by becoming either bourgeois or entering the middle class in general, or becoming a proletarian because of competition. It is now more often the case, in which case he can free himself by joining the proletarian movement, i.e., it is the more or less communist movement. This is probably the densest section we can get to fit into one paragraph alone, so let's just focus on the handicraftsman alone, as Engels does here as well, despite mentioning proles here. The handicraftsman, or sometimes the vagabond in travel, is more or less your guild worker in pursuit of becoming the very guild master they were trained under, or the guild master they currently work under in any other guild that may reflect their trade. Anywho, as of such, it makes them petit bourgeois. They work for the most part, but are accumulating capital, so they become more and more bourgeois. By the end of this, they become one, a petit bourgeois or bourgeois, if they acquired enough capital to become such categories where they can own their own means of production. However, for a petit bourgeois, they still have to work to accumulate the remaining capital to become bourgeois, because they still don't have the necessary capital to just live off of the stocks or capital that they generate thanks to their factory or their guild that they have set up in order to make the means of production workable and runnable. Of course, if a handicraftsman lacked enough capital to become a petit bourgeois, then they are freed by becoming a prole, as their guild system is superseded to a factory system thanks to competition, that being bourgeois competition, capitalist competition. Those who become proles can further still free themselves by joining the communist movement to supersede their current conditions, as they saw their existence transforming from a handicraftsman to a prole, and know that nothing is secret truly. The manufacturing worker of the 16th to the 18th centuries still had, with but few exception, an instrument of production in his own possession, his loom, this family spinning wheel, a little plot of land which he cultivated in his spare time. The proletarian has none of these things. The manufacturing worker always lives in the countryside in a more or less patriarchal relation to his landlord or employer. The proletarian lives, for the most part, in the city, and his relation to his employer is purely a cash relation. The manufacturing worker is turned out of his patriarchal relation by big industry, loses whatever property he still has, and in this way becomes a proletarian. Finally, we reached the universal manufacturing worker particularity of the universal working class. This manufacturer, much like the serf, has a secured existence, and also the means of production to themselves. Yet, the manufacturer's contractual obligation is to the merchant and not to the lord. Thus, their existence is defined and secured by the needs of the merchant, not to their lord. Sometimes this very same merchant can be also their landlord. However, most of the time, it's to their merchant, not to their landlord. To take this a step further, the relations of production between the manufacturer and the ruling class is patriarchal, since technically the mercantile feudal order still persists in the countryside. If we wish to slip into Lacan for a bit, the paternal signifier, or the name of the father, manifests itself strongly here in the form of a big other that haunts the ideology of the person. How they're willing to enforce this big other to their neighbors, and lives through the cash relations between the two classes that coexists between each other and unites them economically, however one-sided it truly is for the ruling class, and how much it is a detriment to the working class. This connection to society, the big other, is still there within pro-bourgeois relations, but is more enforced by cash relations and without a care for the ideology that keeps the system maintained. It wouldn't be until the conservatives, later on, would finally adopt capitalism truly into their ideology that this return to patriarchal relations would be established in the cities and defending the system reformed. But because now it only has to justify itself in cash relations, it doesn't have to have much reason to spout carefully to the crowd what to believe in, as long as it benefits itself in the end of the day. In certain respects, Adorno's spectacle, which is the will of capital in the superstructural sense, can be called a conservative reaction to what was lost in the transition of the mercantile feudal social order that was superseded to become the capitalist social order. Remember, I said in certain respects. Anywho, this reaction, or this return to patriarchal relations, can never truly return to what it was back then, to truly return to what they desire as such, because there has been too much dialectical progress that has happened in between the mercantile feudal epoch and the capitalist epoch that has happened since then. Thus, we can only have a perversion of the matter that enforces the ideology of capitalism and programs people to defend it defend it too, no matter what, even though ideologically it conflicts with the main ideology that persists in society. And this will become a real big problem later on, especially when we're talking about the counterculture, and so on, and so on.